This move initiates a king's pawn opening, aiming to control the central squares and open lines for the queen and bishop. This move, nf6, immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for a flexible development, often leading to the Indian defenses. A sound strategic choice to counter d4. Developing the knight to f3 supports the central pawn and prepares for kingside castling. A standard and flexible move in many Indian defenses and queen's pawn openings. This move, 2, e6, prepares to develop the king's bishop to an active square, often g4 or f5, and can transition into various solid defenses like the queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian if white plays c4. This move prepares to control the center and develop space, typical of many queen's pawn openings, and can transpose into various solid defenses for black. This move immediately challenges white's centralized pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's development and potentially create imbalances by exchanging the bishop for a knight. This move develops the bishop and prepares to castle, aiming to contest black's initiative by exchanging the bad bishop for white's good one. This move, a knight sacrifice in the Ruy Lopez, intentionally breaks black's bishop pair and resolves the pin, simplifying the position and opening lines for white's rooks. This move develops the knight to a natural square, solidifies control of the central squares, and prepares to recapture the bishop, aiming for a stable and flexible pawn structure. This move initiates the queen's gambit declined by claiming central space and challenging white's pawn structure, aiming for a more dynamic and less passive game. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop, a common plan in many queen's pawn openings to control the long diagonal and support the center, while also avoiding potential issues with the d4 pawn being attacked after white develops their bishop. Black correctly completes kingside development and prepares to contest the center, aligning with common strategies in the queen's Indian defense after white's early g3. This move fianchettos the bishop, preparing to control the long light squared diagonal and support a future queenside expansion. This move prepares to develop the queenside knight to a more active central square, reinforcing the pawn on d5 and potentially supporting a later c5 pawn break. This move, castling kingside, completes white's initial development and secures the king, creating a harmonious setup that prepares for central play and potential pawn breaks. This move connects the rooks and prepares for potential central pawn breaks, while also supporting the knight on d7. 9. qc2 repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support a central pawn advance or a kingside attack, while also connecting the rooks. This move prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop to b7, aiming to exert pressure along the long diagonal and potentially challenge white's central control. This capture resolves central tension and opens the c-file, preparing to challenge black's central pawn majority. This move recaptures the central pawn, contesting white's central space and preparing to develop black's pieces more actively, specifically the queen and king's knight, while opening up lines for piece play. This move boldly claims central space, challenging black's knight and preparing to solidify white's pawn structure for potential future king's side attack. This move challenges white's central knight and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure by potentially forcing exchanges on the c-file. This move repositions the queen to potentially attack black's knight on b4 and also aims to connect the rooks and potentially support an e5 pawn advance. This move aggressively challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's development and create counterplay on the queenside. This move challenges the strong knight on b4, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated piece play and gain space on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the central advance of the c-pawn and contest the d4 square. This capture on c5 resolves white's tension in the center and simplifies the position. But it also opens the d-file for black's rook and allows their knight to reach a more active square. Via c4, black recaptures on circa 5, opening the b-file for rook activity and maintaining a strong pawn center. While white's knight on b4 is now awkwardly placed. This knight maneuver aims to activate the piece by finding an outpost on c4, potentially attacking the c5 pawn and preparing to support an e4-e5 pawn push. This move wisely retreats the bishop, avoiding the knight's pin and preparing to contest the crucial c5 square. This move strategically repositions the knight to a strong central outpost, aiming to control key squares and potentially launch a kingside attack while supporting a central pawn push. This pawn structure often arises from the Nimzo-Indian defense or Queen's Indian defense and aims to challenge white's central control and open lines for black's pieces. This recapture on e5 centralizes the queen, supports the pawn on e4, and prepares to contest the now open c-file while putting pressure on black's queenside. This move, Rad8, establishes an active rook on the open d-file, preparing to exert pressure on white's d4 pawn and potentially support a central pawn push. This move unifies white's rooks on the central d-file, preparing to exploit the open file for central control and potential pressure on black's king. This move aims to break the pin on the knight and immediately contest the central e4 pawn, preventing white from easily establishing a dominant central presence. This repositioning of the queen aims to reroute it to a more active square, potentially targeting the weakened dark squares around black's king or supporting advances on the queenside. Exchanging the rooks here simplifies the position and removes a potentially active white rook, allowing black to focus on developing their queenside play and potentially creating counterplay along the c-file. This rook exchange simplifies the position and centralizes the remaining rook, preparing to contest the crucial d-file and support pawn advances in the center or queenside. The rook returns to the d-file to contest control of this crucial open file, which is now the primary strategic battleground. This move centralizes the rook to a more active square, preparing to contest the d-file or potentially swing to the kingside if the opportunity arises. This move redeploys the knight to a better square, aiming to support the d5 pawn and potentially re-enter the game on the kingside or central squares. This move forces the exchange of queens, simplifying the position and leading to an endgame where white's knight on c4 is more actively placed than black's knight on b8, aiming to exploit black's potentially weak d6 pawn. Black recaptures the rook, simplifying the position and centralizing the queen onto the open d-file, which is a favorable outpost for her in this endgame-like scenario. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing the weak b-pawn and preparing for potential pawn breaks in the center or queenside. The bishop finds an active square on a6, preparing to contest the queenside and potentially pressure white's pawn structure or create tactical opportunities. White seeks to activate the bishop on h3, aiming to exchange it for black's strong bishop on a6 and simplify into an endgame where white's rook on d1 is more active on the open d-file. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, supporting the pawn on c5 and potentially preparing for future pawn breaks or piece exchanges. This move sacrifices the bishop to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain a strong central passed pawn, aiming to exploit the resulting king's safety issues for white. This move removes the king from the newly opened diagonal and central file created by white's capture, preventing immediate tactical threats and preparing for potential piece redistribution. The bishop repositions to d5, creating a strong diagonal threat towards black's king and simultaneously preparing to exchange itself to weaken black's pawn structure. This move correctly centralizes the knight, contesting white's strong central presence and preparing to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces. This move develops the queen to a more active square where it supports the knight's control of the d4 square and prepares to exploit the weakened light squares around black's king. This move correctly addresses white's strong piece on a4 by exchanging it for black's bishop, which was a critical defender of the kingside and was also indirectly supporting the knight on c6. This capture on c4 regains the pawn and clarifies the central tension, but allows black's knight to penetrate to d4, potentially disrupting white's coordination. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, connecting the rooks and preparing to defend the c5 pawn while potentially supporting a future advance on the queenside. This move prepares to activate the king by moving it away from the central files and potentially to a safer square, while also freeing up the h-file for potential piece maneuvering. This move develops the queen to an active square, challenging white's control of the central dark squares and preparing to potentially contest the g-file should white's king remain on g2. This move decisively opens the e-file, creating immediate pressure on black's kingside defenses and potentially liberating white's queen and bishop for more active roles. This pawn capture on e5 opens the f-file and allows black's queen to become more active, while also creating a potential passed pawn for white on the d-file if white can support it. This capture on c5 creates a passed pawn on c6, which will demand considerable defensive attention from black and opens avenues for white's rooks. This pawn push aims to create luft for the king and potentially prepare a g5 advance, though it also weakens the kingside pawn structure. This forcing queen check exploits the opponent's weakened king safety and opens up a decisive tactical sequence to regain material and dismantle black's defense. The king escapes the immediate check and repositioning to the king's flank offers a better chance of avoiding future checks and potential mating nets. This stunning move sacrifices the bishop to deliver a decisive checkmate in one by forcing the black king into a mating net. This move appears to be an attempt to escape the discovered check, but the king is still exposed and vulnerable to further tactical threats after white's mating attack. This forcing check is a powerful tactical blow, forcing the black king into a more exposed position and potentially leading to a decisive material advantage through discovered attacks or mating sequences. This move creates a crucial defensive pawn chain, preventing further checks along the g-file and preparing to contest the open diagonals with the king. This queen sacrifice is a powerful maneuver, forcing the black king into a mating net by clearing the diagonal for the bishop and creating an unstoppable discovered attack.